Hey everyone, in this episode we speak to Paul Goodge and Al Simmonite, who between them have such a magnitude of experience, knowledge, and views on leadership and project management. We're sure that you're going to love this, but if you want a bit of a background and perhaps a bit more context, check out episode 13 and 21 when we spoke with Al and Paul in season 1. Enjoy the banter and the insight. Here we go.
Hello, project people. Welcome to the Project Shadow podcast. I'm Val Matthews, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dale Fung.
Hi, folks. Hey, Val. Really excited for this episode. But before we jump in, we need to give a shout out to Mr. Dave Pulford, who is a friend of the podcast and director of Von Rose Limited. Dave sent us these awesome shirts. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see them. But if you're listening to us, they say, what a difference a Dave makes with 2 massive thumbs up. And he challenged Val and I to wear them on an episode. And if we did, he'd donate £50 to my Movember cause, which is amazing. And he also challenged others out there to match him on it. So thanks very much for that, Dave. A little bit about Dave. Dave is a project control specialist and he's an EVM subject matter expert. And we'll hopefully coerce him onto a pod soon. But if you want to get in touch with Dave, you can check out vonnerose.co.uk, and that's spelled VONNEROSE.co.uk.
Thanks, Dale and Dave. What a great cause. And just a reminder to listeners to hit subscribe. That's the subscribe button on whichever platform you listen to your good podcasts and or on our YouTube channel for bonus bits. On this episode, we're joined by Al Simmonite and Paul Goodge. Hi, Al and Paul. Great to have you on the pod.
Hi.
Hi.
On this pod, we're going to be chatting to Al and Paul about simplicity and complexity and some other ambiguities in projects, enough to take us all over the show. So hang on tight for this one. But before we do, here's Dale with a short bio for Al and Paul.
Cheers, Val. So a short one for Al. Al is the MD of Advance Consultancy and boasts a background in the military, program management, and bid management. Al focuses on empowering leadership and team development. Outside of work, Al is a serious amateur landscape and travel photographer. Slightly longer short version for Paul. Paul is internationally regarded as a program management and change management specialist. He's noted for his ability to swiftly and accurately diagnose issues and evolve solutions, both from a technical and behavioral point of view. Whilst Paul has spent considerable years operating at board level, he's equally comfortable out in the workplace. Possessing a combination of technical professionalism and a high degree of empathy, he's able to work intimately with individuals within a team and the team as a whole in enabling transformation. In all of his senior roles, he successfully implemented capability improvement plans that received significant praise both internally and with the customer base. Over his career, he held a variety of roles, both in line leadership and a number of functional responsibilities, providing him with insights across the whole of the enterprise. He has chaired or sat on a wide variety of internal and external committees and steering groups. An ex-board member of the Association of Project Management, he has continued to work very closely with the organization and was in the first cohort to achieve Chartered Project Professional status. He achieved his MBA from Cranfield University in 1994. Paul retired from full-time employment in 2012 and enjoys a wide range of interests. His portfolio encompasses consultancy work to various companies, the P3M profession, executive coaching, and extensive work with various charities operating locally, nationally, and internationally. He's an avid long-distance walker, worldwide traveler, and greatly enjoys music, reading, sport, fine food, and wine in his spare time. He has recently commenced studying for a PhD. He lives in Wiltshire in the UK. Wow, I'm parched after that. I don't know about everyone else, but that's an amazing bio.
Cheers.
And it's well worth reading out. There was a bit of banter before, which was great. Paul and I'll obviously know each other as well as good friends. And the length of bio was quite topical just before we started. But I want to welcome both of you gents on back from season 1. It's great to have you back. We had a great time speaking to you individually And we thought let's have a combination and talk about something very ambiguous, right? Complexity and simplicity. Now, what does that actually mean? I mean, Val also mentioned a whole bunch of other aspects going into the different types of dilemmas you get. But I feel like this could go anywhere. But I'll start with Al, simply because Paul got more airtime with his bio there in the beginning. But not only that, Al, you mentioned that you've been speaking about complexity and simplicity in your breakfast club that you have. I wonder if you could kind of lead us into some of the thoughts and topics you've been talking about.
Yeah, so and thanks for that, and always good to listen to Paul's extended bio. Reminded of all the things that he's interested in. You're absolutely right. We always enjoy a bit of banter. So yeah, complexity and simplicity. This is very much in the complex major project space. So we've been discussing this recently, and complexity is inherent in the environment that we seem to be operating in. And if the last year is anything to go by, it's only getting worse or more, depending on your definition. Yet at the same time, one of the real aims of good project management, in my view anyway, is to try and simplify as much as possible. So this dilemma comes from this juxtaposition, and Paul will enjoy that word, I'm sure, of those two elements together, and how does that play out in the day-to-day lives of those involved in delivering projects. So the environment itself drives complexity, yet at the same time we're trying to simplify the process as much as possible, so that we know on an individual level, on a day-by-day basis, what we've actually got to do to get this thing done. So there's no answer to that, I don't think, and I guess that's the point of having the discussion. But there'll be lots of different perspectives on what that actually means, and how does that play out to individuals at different levels and in different roles and different parts of a major complex project.
And I think one of the fascinating behavioural aspects behind this, Al, is that I think people now get seduced by the idea of complexity. It's almost as if there has to be a badge of honour that, no, my project is complex, well, so is mine. In fact, mine's more than yours. And I
agree with that, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I've been reviewing something recently, and all the bid documentation talked about it being a complex project. But quite frankly, when you looked into it, you said, well, what actually characterises this as being complex? And the answer was it wasn't particularly, and it isn't, and it shouldn't be. So I guess part of the danger there is that if we're not careful, we try to convince ourselves it's complex, and we therefore start to apply managerial solutions and behavioural characteristics, which are not the most appropriate to that particular situation. So I think that talks to your simplicity point, where we're moving away from what could be a relatively simple approach, and we're dressing up into something more, over-engineering it, second-guessing ourselves. So I think that's one, and many organisations will have their own sort of matrices on how complex is this, and they're kind of mostly similar, the ones I've seen. They've all got sort of slightly different flavours to them. But I'm not aware, I don't know if anybody else on this call is aware of, apart from there's an organisation down in Val's neck of the woods, the International Centre for Complex Project Management. But apart from that, is there any sort of coordinating body, the matrix that people could go to, or are people just coming up with their own every time and doing the opposite of your keep it simple, stupid, simplicity type mantra, which I think I heard you said. We're complicating a situation, and we don't understand the difference between complicated and complex sometimes.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to mention that if you didn't. Yeah,
so this is the old mystery wrapped up in enigma type thing, isn't it? It's just like I think that is part of the problem. There's probably 2 or 3 elements to that. But I mean, does that chime with you?
Yeah, it does, and I think the complex versus complicated debate is an interesting one, because a lot of people confuse the two, and I don't think there is a standard definition of the two and what the difference is. And I think, as you said, that's part of the problem. Every organisation, every kind of environment, every sector has a slightly different way of interpreting that. But I think, certainly in the sectors that I'm in at the moment, that we're operating in as a business, so mainly infrastructure, transport, and those kind of related sectors, the complexity comes from the environment, from the stakeholders, from the requirement setting environment, not necessarily from the delivery of the project. So the building of an asset, a bridge, building or whatever, yes, it's complicated, it's technically complicated, but it's, and probably don't shout at me on from the audience on this one, it's not difficult, it's straightforward. You build foundations, you build a structure, you fit it out, you commission it, you deliver it to the owner. I'm not denying there are huge challenges in doing that, but actually the process is itself relatively straightforward. The complexity comes from the funders, the stakeholders, the community, government, from politics, all those other things. And I think that is, if we can separate those two out a bit, I think it makes the environment slightly easier to understand. Does that chime with you, Paul?
Yeah,
I kind of. Sorry, just to jump in there, I did find a reasonably useful paragraph around this, which is basically what you're saying. It says, when we say something is complex, we usually mean it's not straightforward, which is what you're saying. And then it says, when we say it's complicated, we typically mean it's not working like we'd like it to.
Yeah.
Does that kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that from chapter 2 of your memoirs, which you're still writing about?
Actually, it's in one of Paul Goodge's books. I can't release the title just yet, but
that's because it's not written it.
So that's a great quote there. I think what we're touching on, a couple of things here for me, is one that again back to what Al was saying. I mean, to me, there's a continuum here, and sometimes we think it's discontinuous, and I don't think it is so much. There's degrees of complexity, but no, we've still got those basic techniques that we should all be very familiar with, and we ignore those at our peril. Now, if we move away from those, then regardless of debate about just how complex it really is, the thing's going to fall over, because we still need to get those basics of integrated master scheduling, risk management, whether earned value management or proxy we're using. So, but there is something for me very much about what Al said there about the dynamic interfaces, significant political, external interfaces, communications, and the more you've got of those, it's a geometric progression, isn't it? The number of interfaces you have and how that plays out, that stakeholder management. On the actual thing itself, whatever thing we're talking about, I think another dimension is around the sort of technology. I think one of the things that characterizes complexity in project delivery is when the technology solution is a generation or more beyond that which you currently understand. So you can only define by outcome rather than by effect, rather than how you actually get there by the solution. And so there's this ability to actually almost sort of go on trust that I don't know how I'm going to get there. I don't quite know what the next generation is going to give me, but I've trust in my processes and the ability, and I can do some historical analysis, etc. But there's going to be an element of trust that I can get there, and that's what makes it uncertain and what makes it complex, because the various factors that play into how is that going to play out with those stakeholders and everything else. That's where I think complexity gets very interesting.
Yeah.
Can I just come back on that a second? I apologize, Dale and Val. We'll probably feel like we're going to cut you out of this one, because we'll just keep passing the baton back.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you touched on a really interesting point there, Paul, which is this alignment or misalignment of complexity and uncertainty. And I think they again get conflated perhaps in some people's minds, but I think there is a difference between the two, isn't there? And how you deal with uncertainty and how you are agile and flexible in your approach to deal with the unknown unknowns, or the Rumsfeld equation, if you like, is perhaps quite different in terms of thinking to how you deal with known complexity.
Yeah. So in terms of leadership skills, if you're the project leader for a complex project, what do you think are some of the sort of key skills you need to be able to effectively discharge that, Al?
Well, you've hit my favourite topic, as Val and Dale know. For me, leadership is about creating the environment and recognising the right environment for the where you are in a project or a program. So leadership is about enabling those around you, those that work for you, those that work with you. So if you're working in a complex and uncertain environment, then it's about creating the environment where there's that, and I'll use the phrase, psychological safety to explore new ideas. And your point about technology, what is the next generation beyond where we are now that we can use to deploy in this project to create this asset or to generate this outcome that's going to improve the journey and the outcome. That requires that explorative culture in the organization, and that has to come from leadership. So there's got to be a willingness to try and fail, but bound that in a way that it's not going to fail the project. I could probably go on, but that's probably a starting point.
I think it's a fundamental building block. I agree completely. It's about being bold, holding the teams accountable, but having faith in their ability to do that, fail fast, learn. It's about putting the bound around that. I agree.
So, I mean, holding accountability, absolutely, but also being accountable for that through yourself. And I, one of my favourite leadership phrases is, all of the blame, none of the credit. I think that encapsulates for me what good leadership should be like, which is, if your team do good work, you let them take the credit for that. But by giving them the empowerment and delegation to make mistakes, when they make mistakes, you're also equally accountable upwards.
In the podcast that I had the pleasure of doing some months ago now, some moons back, with Val and Dale, if my memory serves, one of the things I was whittering on about was about sort of adaptive leadership styles. And an enlightened project leader will understand that it's the guys closest to the coalface, to what's going on, that will have the answers, really. And your job is to kind of really set the framework for them, ask the right questions, and help them get there. And I think that just gets writ large in a complex project management situation. Although part of the wrap around that is that it's even more important, but even more difficult to be able to sell a vision of where you're going.
Yes.
Because what's the acronym that I think the Americans tend to use? VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Is that the one? VUCA.
Yep.
Oh,
yeah.
I'd
like to challenge back on that in a minute, because there's another acronym that we use, which I think describes the complex project space even better. But I'll let you finish off your train of thought.
Okay, cool. What was my train of thought? Just remind me. So
maybe that's the complex environment we're operating in.
So writ large with the wrap around this, and so it's right and proper to hold teams accountable and to give them that space, as I think we've just been discussing. But they're going to be feeling uncertain as well, and somehow you need to be able to exhibit that sort of sense of confidence that it's okay. Going back to that point about the technologies beyond what we know at this moment in time, you've got to be able to convince yourself, convince other people that I know what the game plan is. I know how we're going to get there. Maybe I can't share all of it with you right now because there's bits but we're and the truth quite often is you actually kind of make it up a bit as you go along, because there is no playbook for this. But you somehow got to convince, I'll say, yourself and others that it's okay. It's a 10-chapter book. I've given you the first 2 chapters. I'm giving you chapter 3 next week, and it's all going to be okay. Now you're desperately trying to work out what chapter 3 is yourself and whether there really are 10 chapters. But that's part of your role. That's part of what I think you have to do. Some people are very comfortable in that space, and some people aren't. So anyway, you wanted to challenge me on whether
no. Develop the thought, really. I think I totally agree with that sort of 10-chapter right the 3rd chapter kind of point. And I think, as you say, but there's also nothing wrong with admitting an element of vulnerability. And I think the other key aspect of leadership is a willingness to accept some vulnerability, and recognize that you're not there as a leader to do everything and know everything and understand everything. it's about catalyzing the team around you to do all those things with you and for you and on your behalf. But I think the other acronym that we use that kind of builds on VUCA is CATUR, C-A-T-U-R, and that's complexity, ambiguity, tension, uncertainty, and risk.
Okay.
I think, and it's kind of, and my colleague Alexander will hopefully give me a thumbs up for sort of using that, because it's something that he's been developing within our work we do. And I think those 5, kind of build on VUCA a bit, but actually if you put them in the complex project space, they're sort of really, so the tension bit I think is the difference. And it's recognizing that in these environments there is going to be tension. There's going to be tension between the external stakeholders, the funders, the requirement setters, the deliverers, across all tiers of of delivery, and you're never going to remove that tension because it's inherent in the environment. So the simplification comes from recognizing then and managing and dealing with that tension in a productive and positive way rather than a negative way. Does that make sense?
I think so. And as you explain it to me, the words going through my head are words like humility and openness. So no, it's being humble enough to say, hey, be honest, you're the senior stakeholder, and I'm not sure if there are 10 chapters. I'm not really 100% sure what chapter 3 is, but I've got a pretty good idea. But we are open to ideas here. We are actually open to your suggestions. So I think that's important. If I understand it rightly, that's important, because that's where you move from destructured tension to creative tension, which is what we aspire to.
And tension is important. You need an element of tension to generate that creativity, don't you? If you don't, if you get this, and this is where we talk about diversity and diversity of thought rather than sort of the standard view of diversity. If you don't bring diverse ways of thinking and behaving into a team, albeit they've got to be aligned, you don't get that energy and that dynamic and that innovation that you're looking for to generate the solution that's going to give you this outcome better, faster, cheaper, or even just to get it done in the first place.
So my suspicion is people listening to this, I'd like to think that more than Dale and Val will ever listen to this. There'll be some people out there in complex project land who are going through this, going, well, it all sounds great in theory, guys, but hang on a minute, what's it like for me in the minute, in the hour? And if I go back to some of my experience, it's the loneliness of command, and it can feel very lonely. So I think there's some interesting sort of human behavioural dynamics which inevitably kick in. It's the old saying about failure is an orphan and success has many parents. And when you've got a complex, and it's not immediately obvious to anyone how you're going to get there, there will be a lot of people that will want to distance themselves from it until they can see that success really is coming and around the corner. They wouldn't want to be associated with it beforehand unless they had to. I think it's part of an interesting challenge about how can you draw in other stakeholders that can provide those ideas to help create that creative tension that you've just been talking about, so that you have a more enhanced solution when, quite frankly, people are going to be very nervous about it, and there's always good reasons to go and do something else. So you've got, there'll be people out there at this moment in time that are desperate for some genuine proper help, as opposed to the help that's normally applied in the drive-by shooting scenario. But how do they manage to engage those people? Because it's going to be tough.
It is. I'm loving this, Val.
We should let you get a word in it.
No, this is great, because the more that Al and Paul talk, the better for everyone else, I think. They listen to us enough. But I just wanted to comment before handing to Val to, I guess, shoot the next question, or even if you want to change direction. But there's no real need to. I think this is a great rabbit hole. Just when you were talking about complexity, and I was thinking up front, how do we know whether something is complex or complicated or simple? And one of the things that the organization I'm working in have is what's called a characterization matrix, where you take all of the various aspects and, being very methodical in control space, you assess, what is the nature of the technical solution? How large is the team size? What is the commercial setup, etc., etc. And based on those types of marks, strategic importance, the works, you come out with whether it's a simple project all the way through to a highly complex one. But then the other thing that also popped into mind was perhaps we need something like a balanced scorecard to also see where this all fits in as well. And then you can potentially measure it along the way. So yeah, just one or two comments, but I'm loving this, Val. I think if we commented halfway through the pod and just let the first half and second half be Al and Paul, I'd be happy.
So let me be clear. You've interrupted to say that you didn't think there's a need for you to interrupt. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Is that an unnecessary complex intervention then?
It is. I was also thinking, Paul, was Al's bio and your bio a example of simplicity and complexity as well, but we won't go there.
I'd like to explain it to you, but I fear it doesn't matter. Carry on.
It'll go straight over my head.
Mic drop. All right. So in response?
I mean, just what Dale said. So what Dale said about the sort of the characterization matrix. I guess the question back is, once you've categorized something in those boxes, what does that mean for then how you go and then deliver that differently?
Right. Yeah.
What does the highly complex mean in terms of you do more or differently than you would done in a complex or a simple project? Because I think, and how you work around the boundaries of that as well, because these things, you end up with a very, if it scores 91, it's highly complex. If it scores 90 or below, it's complex. But that's never the sort of definitive line, is it?
No, so it's not an overall total mark and you go, this is one size fits all. You'd have a look at what is making it complex and which areas are more simple. So if for example the nature of the contract, the commercial setup is particularly complex, then you'd want to bolster that, and perhaps the technical solution isn't. And so it depends. It depends. Like I say, it's an assessment rather than this is the score and you're complex, and so this is will shoehorn you into this box. It's more a process where you can understand what should I be focusing on, because as you say, what makes a project or program or even portfolio complex? Well, there's various factors, and so yeah, it's again one of those 50 shades of gray moments in the project space where there isn't one answer, but it does allow you
projects.
Very interesting projects, but it does allow you to identify what makes it complex and what makes it simple, rather than just saying I'm working on a complex project.
So for me, Dad, I guess my perspective on that, apart from that terrifying insight into what your reading habits are, is that what I'm understanding with this sort of characterization matrix, or however you want to call it, balanced scorecard, for me that's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end.
Yep.
So for me it's very much about just facilitating and enabling the discussion. Now we've got lots of these sort of tools, and as long as and I think the danger sometimes is, and Al and I have both spent quite a bit of time with engineering led companies, even when they profess not to be, they're engineering led companies. If you cut them open and do your MBTI on it, they're going to be ISTJs. This is the way they see the world. And there's a danger that you provide that sort of framework and that becomes it, and it becomes definitive. And I think what we're talking about here, the way it should be interpreted can get lost. So I think there's a danger there, because for me, it's about, okay, now it enables a discussion. And we don't lose sight of that, and I think there's a danger we do. It's just sort of unintended consequence that when these things get put out there into the world, they get misused, not in any malicious, intentional way. It's just what happens.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. If you don't use the tool in the correct way, then absolutely. And I think what you're pointing out is that framework then becomes really important, because if it's just focused on one specific view, let's say engineering from that standpoint, then you won't get all the full perspective from the entire organization. And I think that's the point really is, and I agree with you. It shouldn't be, we've assessed this and now forever till the end, this is where we'll shoehorn this project into. But yeah, I know Val's dying to also get a comment or question in there, so I'm gonna let him talk a bit.
I just want to come back on it as well. If Val's going to move on, I just want to make a comment back on that, or do you want to comment?
Go for it.
I'll
comment after you, Al.
I'd like to come in after Al.
Good. There's one point I wanted to pick up on this sort of characterization as well, which I think it goes to something that Paul mentioned earlier on about, you know, the audience and you know, what does this mean for me sitting in a complex project doing this job day to day. Complexity isn't correlated with scale, and I think at an individual level it's very much not correlated with scale, because if you're, you know, a project manager leading a relatively small project, your complexity is going to be high because you're dealing with so many different aspects, whereas if you're in a mega project, there's going to be teams of people and each will have their own specialization and niche. So at an individual level, they'll be much more narrowly focused and hence operating in perhaps a slightly less complex individual environment. So I think we need to be careful not to correlate individual complexity and organizational complexity, because they are different.
Agreed, definitely.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think we need to take into account if we're going down this path is a temporal aspect to this. So I think there's also a danger of organisations. You run this thing at the outset and it's set in stone for the duration. And the point is you should revisit this. You know, there's going to be activities that the organisation will be doing to try and de-risk, to decomplexify, to simplify various aspects of it. And I think that sometimes gets lost. It's like, you know, the old business case that gets drawn up for a major project with its MDAO, its master database of assumptions and so on. That doesn't get business case doesn't get revisited. These things get used once, and they set the course for the remainder when they should be being revisited. So I'm not against it in principle. I just think in practice there's a few pitfalls that it seems over the years in different ways we haven't necessarily learned from.
Yeah, I was just going to add. No, I'm happy just sitting here, listening to you guys badger on. But I agree with you guys. I think with this characterization, I don't understand unless I know the outcome why it would be of value. If it's effectively adding value to the objective of making successful projects, whatever the measures might be, then it's a good idea. But I see this time and time again as well, where policy defines behavior versus behavior defining policy. And this has happened on projects where I'll have to fill in blank spreadsheets because that's the process, even if I have nothing to add. It's just this cumbersome, low value transactional work that gets in the way. And that can make it complex because you've got these many parts, but there's an element of doing more with less, which we've all done on projects. It's like, what do you start, stop, and continue? And we do these retrospective boards wherever we go now. We say, right, if we got everybody in a room, we said, what do you want to stop? Everyone's really good at that. What do you want to continue? And what do you want to start? Where people get stuck is on the start tab.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of people who completely understand how to manage ambiguity and try and as well make their jobs like kind of fill a bag type style where, you know, they want to make their job sound important, not because they have to, but because out of necessity, there's an element of role that they need to consume. So if you put a position description in place, it's almost like a prophecy in some way. Some personalities will define themselves by that role description, and thus anything outside of that becomes overspill and someone else's problem. This is particularly on mega projects. So that becomes complex for somebody else. I just wanted to add that. But in terms of this, what you guys were talking about, I wrote it down a minute ago because you all had acronyms and I didn't have one. And I thought, well, I better write one down. So I come up with VLICE.
We've got one about you we can share later.
Is it about my hair? Or the cat on our lap?
It's in it somewhere, yeah.
Oh, okay. Good. VLICE, vulnerable leaders in complex environments. Stay with me. There is a triangle. And in this triangle, there is trust, certainty, and simplicity. So you feel free to put that in your books if you're listening. That's me. Over to you, Paul or Al, for comment.
Well, you guys know I like a triangle model, so yeah.
Hang on, Val. We can't let you get away with that. You just throw that in there. This is how Australians have helped the world wars, isn't it? They just walk into a room, take the pin out of the grenade, and walk out whistling, saying, "Yeah, I'm going to put another shrimp on the Barbie." That was fine. I mean, what?
This hey, this came from you guys. I was purely playing it back, and as you guys spoke, I wrote it down. Vulnerable leaders, yeah, that's a really important thing in complex environments, absolutely. And then what would you need? And you talked about psychological safety, which would be a trust element, certainty, which you were talking about what that chapter 3 looks like, and then simplicity, which is about understanding that complex versus complicated, and how we could bring that back to something that everyone could actually get on board with, enablers, engagement. So really, you guys came up with this. I just was the puppet.
Write it down.
Whatever you want to call me. Yeah. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, joint copyright. We're good with that.
I think there's a human nature aspect to this, which we kind of touched on already, which is how do people develop and progress and make careers in this space? And right or wrong, it's not by delivering what seem to be the simple, easy projects. It's by battling through the difficult, complex projects. So there's almost a counterintuitive behavioural element here, and Paul touched on this earlier about making things more complex than they need to be, because that's how you make your reputation. If you've delivered a project and you've done a huge amount of work behind the scenes to simplify that, make it work, have really great operating slick team, and that project just gets delivered, people will go, well, of course, because that was an easy project. Whereas if you've then delivered the really challenging, up against it, heroic project, like, oh, he did a great job there because look at what he delivered in that difficult environment. Which one of those is the more successful, the better leader? I'll leave you to decide, but I've got a view.
And there's so much wrapped up in that. When I'm nodding my head, it's the old thing about our best firefighters tend to be our best arsonists. Yeah, I mean, what does success look like? Success, you don't really notice it. Yeah, and all too often I'm hearing what you're saying. Absolutely. And it's fascinating. So the people that most naturally gravitate towards this and are good at it, and the two aren't necessarily the same. It is fascinating. So I mentioned the ICCPM earlier, and I know they've got a course on how to train people in this regard. But there's huge limitations to training when it comes to this. One, because they're all different, as we've been discussing. And all too often, I don't know about you, but when you have training providers come to you and say, hey, I've got a great course for you, it's worth buying it off of me. I mean, the curriculum tends to be based upon yesterday's or even last year's problems. Yeah, it is not based, and there's a time lag, I understand, with coming up with some decent training interventions, but the fundamental principles on what it's based, I think, are somewhat outdated. And when you start to get into that debate about, well, whether it's a relatively simple, straightforward project or a more complex one, it's this point about, do we actually understand why projects go wrong? And on the one hand, you can say, well, we do, because we've got a top 10 list. And my top 10 list will look like your top 10 list, it would look like Dale's and Val's, yeah, and anybody else's. And if we go back 10 years and say, what's your top 10 list look like? It looks pretty much the same. Yeah. So does that tell us we do know, or does it tell us we don't know? Because project delivery success isn't getting much better, certainly not in this country if you look at the NAO type reports.
Yeah.
So
well, that NAO just delivered report, haven't they, and lessons learned from major programs, which came out last week, which is, as usual, quite insightful. But as you say, it's nothing we haven't seen before. But I guess the issue is what. When we're operating that space, are we incentivized as individuals and organizations to properly learn from others, or are we incentivized to create our own environment and do things new, and hence potentially repeat the mistakes of our forebears and predecessors? So I think we've got to start looking at the broader environment that incentivizes people and incentivizes careers in this space, because unless we tackle that, we're just going to go around this buoy every single mega and complex project that we operate in.
Yeah, I'm going to take that as rhetorical. So
yeah, oh yeah, so yeah.
But how do we achieve that philosophical shift though that's required?
Well, there's the question. The one of the debates we had where we touched on simplicity and complexity was the role of the requirement setters, as in the clients, and how do clients start to define what they need, and how we get there in a different way. And a lot of the UK public sector clients are HS2 and Crossrail and places like that. They've very much got this sort of the social value angle and apprenticeships and skills, but ultimately it's about delivering a tangible asset, and that ultimately requires you to put concrete in the ground and build something. So I think another element of complexity is coming from those clients and those requirement setters by increasing the complexity of what is needed to be done, and moving away from the simple act of building something. Because by building something right, on time, beautifully and effectively, you are creating value. Do we need to over egg that debate? I don't know, and maybe that's a controversial view to say we don't necessarily we put too much emphasis on skills and diversity and community, when actually all we need to do is build the asset right and well.
I may have misunderstood, Al, because what I heard in your previous was about the way we go about reward systems within organisations.
Yeah, maybe I've mixed 2 points up there, but I think it's a bit of both. Yeah. Yeah,
it's how do we recognise and reward people who are very good at plagiarising? About taking stuff, repurposing it. Because we hear the language. It's a great subject for the C-suite in the boardroom. And yet, when it comes down to it, organisational heroes tend to be the guys that have done the Red Adair bit, have done the firefighting. Sorry, arsonist. Sorry, which one did I mean? Act. So there's some sort of disconnect which is preventing us from going to that place, which we seem to recognise. And maybe it's just something, it's inherent, it's an imminent part of who we are as project managers. So let's have a bit of self-reflection, some reflexivity, as Val would probably call it, in a triangular 2x2 multi-dimensional playing chess against Spock type situation. As project managers, do we accept intellectually, emotionally, that our job is really about being boringly predictable?
I think we should, but I don't think we do.
Because really, that's what we're about, aren't we? We're about, like, there's nothing to see here. Move on. Yeah, I'm on cost. I'm on schedule. I've got 1.01 on CPI and SPI. My TCPI is below. Yeah, nothing to see. Everything's good. And yeah, I can actually give up some resource because, quite frankly, I'm being efficient enough that I can do that. Is that an attractive scenario for most of the PM population? I'll put it out there for discussion.
I'll let Val and Dale come back on that one. Give them a bit of a chance to say something.
We used to always have a dig at the engineers, didn't we, about gold plating, and maybe there's some element of project managers in some form of the other, embellishing their role to do more than they actually need to do. And we used to think it was weird when they thought the term exception management was foreign. They'd be like, what? But I want to see everything. It's like, why? What do you really need to do with that? So yeah, I think you're right. I think you're hitting something. You're hitting a nerve for me, certainly, that there's some element of the job that should be just like, move on. There's nothing to see here. By the way, if everything's on track, if we're on budget, on cost, on time, on quality, then let's not have a meeting to discuss me doing well. Let's continue on. Certainly, yeah, we are a superstructure of unusual norms that, whether it's cultural or not, we seem to do them almost automatically. So there'll be an end of month review that'll take, a good quarter of your brain, I think, to come up with some type of story to weasel your way out of some delay that may or may not be relevant in a couple of months if you actively pursue the mitigations rather than talking fluff upstairs. Yeah, I think you're on a point there for sure. Dale?
I was just thinking, to the question of project managers in general, and if we assume that project managers are typically narcissistic, does that then sort of create the need to have or be involved in something more complex, and henceforth, if it is simple, then it doesn't fulfill that narcissistic need? That was what was going through my head. But I wonder.
Anyone in particular?
Sorry?
Anyone specifically? Or?
No, I mean, maybe
No,
Val Matthews, perhaps.
I think you've hit something there, though, and it goes back to this heroic culture. And I'm equally guilty of this. I love to be energized and enthused to deal with difficult problems. And if, you know, I have a phrase, if I come to work, I've got 10 things to do, I'll do 12. If I come to work and I've got one thing to do, I probably won't do it. And I think that's, you know, indicative of you know, my style and obviously a number of different styles. But that nirvana of that, as Paul just described it, and nothing to see here, move on, it's all on track, I'm giving resource back. That's, dare I say it, potentially boring, but it gives you the better outcome. So there you go. Take it back to the title of this. There's an inherent dilemma in what we do.
By the way, Dale, you are aware that Narcissus wasn't actually in love with himself per se. He was in love with an image reflected back to him that he didn't know was himself.
I did not know that, but
Deeply philosophical for the man doing the doctorate.
yeah.
There you go.
I actually think it's more of a, sorry, just jumping there. I think it's more of an attention deficit disorder that most project managers probably suffer from. You know, there's a shiny thing that comes along and they're like, oh, that looks fantastic. Let me get involved in that.
So tell us about your childhood, your early childhood, Val.
We haven't got that long.
So, but here's the thing, which I think is related to this. There's an old expression about IQ will get you the job, EQ will get you promoted. And I think as project managers, we like to think ourselves as being quite smart. You know, a lot of us, although not myself, you know, come through the engineering route, and that's interesting and challenging. Though being a chartered, you can now be a chartered project professional, as we know. But you know, there's a sort of badge here about intellectually getting this stuff, being understand it, how things fit together, seeing patterns and trends and stuff like that. And that becomes our safety blanket, becomes our comfort. But then to really, I think, to progress and to be the sort of leader that I think I heard Al sort of referring to, which I agree with earlier and stuff, it's this development of EQ. And that is not such a comfortable place for people. And I think if there is some blockers around this, it's understanding this journey. We've got to say journey every day, don't we? I think I've got there. About if you agree with it, you know, it's this notion that IQ will get you the job, EQ will get you promoted. And I think there's a lot in that which I don't think is widely either understood or accepted at the emotional as well as the intellectual level.
No, I'd agree, and we have a model that supports that, Paul, which we deploy, which is we call suitability and eligibility. And so you're eligible, that's your IQ piece. You know, you've got the technical competence, the experience. But are you suitable? Are you suitable, you know, culturally, you know, with leadership style? You know, does the ethos align with what the organisation wants and needs? And you have to have both elements together to be successful.
Yeah.
And we tend to focus inherently on the eligibility piece, the technical competence and experience, and less so on the, as you say, the EQ element.
And I think part of what holds us back in all of this is, again, maybe because because of our backgrounds, we have this desire or even this need to try and find some way of modelling what's going on, and you know, to pick your average run-of-the-mill complex project, the ability to actually model that in any way which is suitably representative and can be used for decision-making purposes. I haven't seen one yet. And yet I think we get seduced by that, and we get seduced by people who come along and say they can do it for us. And with the difficulties, the multi-dimensional nature of the things we're talking about, I just think it's a fool's errand to try and actually pursue that. And I think it runs counter to the, let's just go back to basics. It's part of a continuum. Let's understand the fundamentals of what we should be doing. It's part of what I heard Dale saying as part of the characterization. Let's not just say everything's complex. Yeah, some elements of this aren't. Take the temporal dimension into account, and these things aren't as complex as they were because we now know more. And so yeah, I get worried that we try and model it, whereas of course, no. What's the best bit of software we have on every project? Yeah, and the old expression, brains are wonderful things. They start as soon as we wake up in the morning and don't stop until we get to the office.
Yeah. I mean, you're in danger of opening up the whole discussion for me around digitalization, and the AI debate we had back in the summer, which is a whole other topic I won't dwell into. But the danger of trying to model and hence digitally recreate all of that, I think, is for those who are the digitalization gurus, is one of the danger points for me. And when you get into the conversation about, well, it has to be all about digital transformation, my response to those conversations has always been, in order to do what?
Exactly. And if we
articulate, sorry,
if we go back to the premise that one of the fundamental definitions defining characteristics of complexity is uncertain dynamic interfaces with a multiplicity of stakeholders. Yeah. Tell me how you model that in some bit of software. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, let's just have to hold off until machines can code machines. So when machines model machines, then machines can figure that out. Because I don't think we can.
Favorite topics, Val, I know.
Yeah. There is this thought that behaviors and emotion are just chemical reactions, and as soon as computers can start figuring out chemical reactions that people are going through, they can start preempting, behaviors. But I think we're a long way off there, and that's potentially, sci-fi movie space.
Preempt probably not, but influence definitely. But I think there's the lack of emphasis on culture. I mean, we haven't talked about culture directly yet, but that's another interesting facet around projects, particularly mega projects, where there just isn't any. It seems like there is no priority around culture. I could ask you. So if you look at your waiting list, Dale, and in that characterization sheet, where does it say culture, or does it, or doesn't it?
Well, this is the thing. It's so that framework is whatever you want to put in terms of characterizing. So if culture is something you want to characterize, then you absolutely put that in. That is a theme. If culture is not a big deal, then you don't put it in. So if you're in Australia in the outback and there's no one really visits there, is culture a big thing? Probably not. Everyone's the same culture, maybe. I don't know.
Need a barbecue. That's all you need.
Perhaps. But if you're in London with a melting pot of cultures, you absolutely want to have that in there. You want to understand, am I dealing with perhaps overseas suppliers, subcontractors, language barriers, as you say, customs, the works, time zones, all those things potentially play into it. But I was also thinking, if I'm working on a project and I'm not explicitly told, and I shouldn't be explicitly told, but what are the telltale signs that I'm in a complex project environment or project itself versus something that's just complicated? What do I look out for?
Before we get into that, I don't know if the bottom left of my screen, when I look at you, Dale, where it says critical, it's a comment upon your interviewing style or your battery level.
Yeah, it's the snack level. That's critical.
Snack levels.
You don't have to worry about your battery level. It's got critical. No, you okay?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
Do you want to go that one first, Paul? Or
I wasn't listening to a word he said. What's he on about?
Go ahead, Al.
So for me, it's because I was paying some attention. It's the level of difficulty in drawing a relatively straight line between where I am to where I need to be, to get off contract. And I've been on some fairly big projects, and back to Al's point about complicated versus complex. Even on complicated projects, I think I've been able to draw a pretty good straight line that gets me there, continuous straight line. Now, I think, the more complex it gets, the more that line gets a little bit dotted at times. There's a little sort of discontinuous break up somewhere, and, and that's, we talked about that earlier, I think, sort of that element of trust. So, and that sounds like a simplistic way of describing it, but in my mind, it's it belies a huge amount of difficulty in actually being able to do that. But I think that's part of being a competent project manager. I think it's being part of a competent business manager when you're reviewing these projects. Even if the team themselves can't quite see it, you can see how they're going to get there, perhaps with some help and intervention. So for me, in a simplistic response to, I think, a very good but deep question, that would be my immediate response.
Yeah, and I guess picking on Dale's point about what would you look for and want to see in an environment to decide whether it was complex or otherwise. This is where I get to do my for those of you not watching the video, my Mr. Bond moment with my cat. Mr. Bond. I think it's that clarity. If when you walk into a project team room, for one better word, virtual as it is these days or otherwise, if you can't understand what everyone's doing very quickly, because there is that complexity, that overlap, that ambiguity of who's doing what, because you've got so many different stakeholder groups represented, and because especially when you get to the larger scale, you tend to operate in organizations that are multi-organizational themselves, so joint ventures, alliances, partnerships, whatever one you call them. When you've brought those different organizations together and you've got those different cultures, those different operating models, different operating processes together, then that's where that confusion stems from. So I think if you walked into a figurative project team room and weren't able to see the clean delineation of activity, then I think you're very much in the complex space. That's not to say that you can't have that simplicity and that clarity, but that is where the effort and the leadership challenge comes in, to drive that in, not by default, but by design.
I'd like to explore that a bit, because I've got a real world example at the moment this week. So an unnamed project I'm looking at. And part of the difficulty with this review was that, for whatever reason, the project had found themselves in a situation where every month they were reporting a snapshot of where they were, but the relationship between that and where they were the previous month, and how that relates to the overall program and likely outturn, was missing. So it was very hard to actually understand, even when you look at sort of 3 consecutive reporting packs, to understand what the rate of progress was. And so that made it quite hard to actually understand, what the eventual outturn would be. And whilst it was a project that was self-certifying itself as somewhat complex, I think everybody agreed it wasn't. So I think there is something more to it than that. So sometimes it can just be a bit of a breakdown of managerial controls and insights that are the root cause of that inability to see that, not necessarily because of as a function of complexity. Back to my point about straight line, it's fairly easy to articulate some ways of improving that situation, and I'm pretty darn sure in a few months' time that will be the case. But it's not as a result of simplifying the overall project. It's just a case of putting some managerial controls properly in place. Yeah.
I guess my point, the bit of feedback there. I guess the point about simplicity, and it kind of struck me as I finished speaking and Paul started talking there, is simplicity takes effort. You have to add simplicity in. It doesn't happen by default. So if you recognize that one of the characteristics of good programs is moving towards simplicity, then leadership process has to be driven that way. It can't just be expected to happen. Paul, you and I worked in 2 organizations together and separately, where the organizational culture was just by the nature of it to drive complexity in process. Process never got removed. Process was always added to. And I think to break that mold, you have to be very conscious and proactive to go back to that keep it simple, stupid model.
And to that point, I think, Dale, back to your question, one of the other indicators for me, and this is more of a qualitative, subjective, how would you really measure it type response, but it's the old schoolboys football stuff. So I don't know if you have this expression down in Australia, Val. So when we talk about schoolboys football, the images of, just a bunch of young kids in shorts with catapults in their back pockets and the Beano under their arm playing football, but you know where the football is, even if you can't see it, because it's they're all within 2 yards of it. They're just following each other around. I don't know if you have the equivalent or even the identical analogy down under.
No.
So, and why do I say that? So on projects, it's when you see the team get together on Monday morning for their weekly get together, and it should be a half-day meeting, and it turns into a full-day meeting because there's stuff that we should talk about, and then the next day it should be a bit of a finance meeting, so they bring in a bunch of finance people to join them as well, and because they haven't had time to look at themselves, they've been in meetings all day. And because of the meeting on Monday, they need to get together on Wednesday because these problems they couldn't solve. But they haven't had time to do anything themselves. So about time they brought some other people into the meeting who are close to it so they can explain the problem. And the finance guys need to be there because you haven't really closed out on the finance stuff. And so the finance guys need to understand what the impact of the program on the program is going to be. These problems. And you come to Friday, and this group of people that started off as 7, 8 of the leadership team have just been together all week, except the group is now 17, 18, 20 people. And everyone breathes a sigh of relief on Friday afternoon because they've got the weekend where they can finally get some work done before they go through the cycle again.
Yeah.
Am I the only person that witnesses?
No, you're not.
Not at all.
I exaggerate only slightly for effect. It's an indication of, are we driving simplicity into this, or possibly the contrary, and why? What is it that's stopping us? It may not be complexity, but it's certainly one of those warning signs that says, I need to ask some questions here.
Absolutely.
I think it's actually, if you think about it, particularly on mega projects, and it's driven by the client, as you said, Al, you've got to get clear with the client. This month-end period reporting pace rubbish. It really drives a pressure cooker in a complex environment when it really doesn't need to. And if you could sort that out from the onset, from the start of the project, and understand that you don't need 2 weeks of updating and 2 weeks of reporting to run a project. I'm not convinced at all that that's the requirement, but that seems to be the case everywhere you go. And lucky for you, Dale, you get an extra period in your calendar because they have 13 periods at Transport for London. So good for you. But so it's really strange that you would run this pressure cooker only to be disappointed each month and then be given a whole bunch of actions, like you said, Paul, and then a whole bunch of people, scurry away into a room to talk about it, only to have to do the work on the weekend and still come back with a problem the next month. I think that's also a dilemma. And again, it's policy and process defining behavior rather than the other way around. Not sure what the answer is, because obviously you've got to go back to client and be on board a part of that journey, as we talked about. But what's your views on that?
I think there is something about that continuum we talked about, and again, it's one of those sort of behavioural things that we perhaps like to be in a bit of denial about. That we like to think, project manager, unique undertaking, etc. Every day is exciting and new. There is a lot of repetitive process stuff as project managers, task package managers, work package managers, that is part of everyday project. Not everything is new, and it shouldn't be anyway. There's a lot of recursive, repetitive stuff. And I'm just thinking, as you were talking there about if we're not careful with complex projects, we're being asked to report on stuff on a monthly drumbeat where it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, there's some aspects of it where every couple of months at most, maybe, periodicity to be defined, but certainly not on a monthly basis. However, my suspicion is there's still some elements of that project which we need to make sure are being properly fed and watered and doing what they should do as the infrastructure, as a substructure to what the eventual outcome. Because if we don't get that stuff right, then all the rest of it is for the birds. So for me, I'm thinking, there's probably some merit in some of it being subject to a more frequent drumbeat review, but let's not just put everything into the same box and expect to be able to give anything meaningful on some stuff where the cycle time is just beyond, you know, the usual reporting period. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think if I build on that, that comes back to, you know, Paul's question earlier on about how do you break the cycle, how do you change some of these entrenched, you know, cultural behavioural elements that drive that. And the words that come to mind on what Paul's just said is accountability, trust, and risk. If you can define the right risk appetite and profile, you know, from the client downwards, and then you can have the right trust and accountability within the teams to do the right things at the right time at the right level, then you can start to strip away some of that repetitive reporting and duplication. But until you can define, you know, where does that risk lie and who's the right person to be accountable for, and then to manage that risk, and how you trust those people to do that without looking over their shoulder 24/7 and reporting that on a weekly or a monthly basis, then you're just going to perpetuate the cycle. And I know we've all worked in projects where when you actually break down the amount of time spent reporting on the monthly cycle, you end up reporting on the monthly cycle about day 2 of the monthly cycle, because it takes you the rest of the month to actually put the pack together, go through the 5 levels of review that you need to get it to the CEO or to the MD on the right day of the month. And that leaves you about half a day to actually do the work that you need to do that month. So that was my thought.
I think it's a good deal, because some of that repetitive stuff does need to be, you know, need to make sure it's doing what it should be doing, but the level of seniority of people that should be reviewing that, so let's just link the two.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It's a great another triangle, ART, so art. There you go. It's a great one.
I claim copyright on that one now. Yeah,
that's yours.
But it's a great one to kind of as we head towards the end of the pod, because I know we don't have an infinite amount of time, but we'd love to you know, have you back again. But just to recap on all of it: complexity, complication, simplicity. That bio of Paul's, so much was said in this pod. Were there any final thoughts from yourself, Paul? Perhaps last time you ended up, you gave me some good advice on my looks. I wonder if you have any more for me this time.
Well, there's no point giving advice if it doesn't get followed.
No, not at all. But any final thoughts from you, Paul?
I think this is one of Al's, quite rightly, one of his key points as well. So what is the secret to all this? You know, it's a bit of good drama, a bit of good theatre. I've done it certainly more than once. That when you're having a review of an overpaid person in a too large office, and they go, okay, but you know, what's the solution to me problems? And you go, you've already got the solution, you've written it yourself. And they look at you and you look at them, it's a bit of fun. And they're wondering why on earth they're paying you a lot of money for your consultancy. And you in a dramatic fashion, with your chiffon scarf billowing in the aircon, you drop their own annual report on the desk in front of them and go, the answer's in your own annual report. You know? And I don't have to have read it. I'll bet anybody that within the first few pages, the answer is written very clearly. It says, you know, our greatest asset is our people. And this point about people, process, and tools, for me, the primacy of that's a triangle. Oh, there we go. The primacy is the people side. The greatest asset is our people. So if we're going to have a discussion about what you are doing as the leader of this organisation and helping you solve your own problems, let's just spend a few minutes reflecting upon how you're actually living that value.
Yeah. No, great advice and good tips, and another great triangle. Al, did you want to follow up to that?
Yeah, not much to add to that, as you'd expect, because we tend to agree on these things. I think the one point about leadership as well, and it goes back to the point that we made about vulnerability earlier on, and I think particularly reflecting on this year, to be effective, leaders also have to look after themselves.
Yeah.
I think there's a final point for me, and it's kind of not necessarily aligned to the sort of simplicity and complexity debate, but we can't expect others to do things we don't do ourselves in any shape or form, and particularly as leaders. So if we're expecting others to look after themselves, others to show some vulnerability, then we have to be able to do those ourselves and demonstrate them and be visible doing them. But I agree with Paul, it's all about people.
No, fantastic. I agree with that too. Val?
Oh, you left me to last. I don't have anything to add, obviously, because on most days we all agree. But it's just been great hearing both Al and Paul from their perspectives. And again, I think there was at least 3 or 4 triangles I'm going to have to write out after this. But I also agree it's about the people and empowering that trust and building a culture of responsibility. Because one of the challenges that I've seen a lot is when it does get complex and when people's jobs are on the line and when the project's on the line, you know, it's hard for people to take accountability. And so the leader's the first person to do that. You know, take all the blame, as you said, and none of the credit. That's a really good point. And I'll just press that again. But it's a really good pod. And thanks for joining us again today, guys. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
So just before we go, we have a pop quiz called Tenor.
Oh, yeah.
10
Called
questions. Tenor. 10 questions and answers.
This is more
within,
it.
yeah, within 10
It's
minutes.
2 fibers, Paul.
Yeah. And
There's someone at the door. Got to go.
And yeah, just it is a pop quiz, Paul. Just to let you know. So we will hand over to Val to pick his first victim, and I'll take the second victim through the quiz.
I love the fact you use the word
Victim, yeah. That doesn't fill in with certainty, does it? All right. Why don't we start with Paul then? You ready, Paul?
Start what?
I'm going to rattle through a few questions. You're going to give me the first answer that pops in your head, and we're going to move on. It's going to be painless, swift and painless.
The first answer is Val.
And the second?
There's a 2 Ronnie sketch in there somewhere, I'm sure there is.
All right.
Ready? We'll be real quick, I promise.
Yeah, all right.
First one. What's your morning routine?
Make a cup of tea for my beloved.
Beautiful answer. Number 2. How do you usually plan out your day?
I don't.
Okay. Question 3.
I'm a student.
Astute student. Question 3. How do you deal with stress?
Go for a walk.
Brilliant. Question 4. What's your favorite book, audio, or movie?
Well, book, I would go for Lord of the Rings.
Nice. Question 5. Who is your hero and why?
I refer you to the first answer I gave.
Yeah, but why? You got to add the why.
You didn't say why. Yeah, exactly. Question 6. What is your favorite sound?
Is this censored?
Don't think so.
I'll go for the section called Apocalypse in 9/8, co-starring the delicious talents of Gabble Ratchet, which is part of Supper's Ready, one of the greatest songs by one of the greatest bands.
There's a really complex answer for you.
That was. Question 7. What is the biggest mistake you've made on a project?
Try and say the best way of expressing it. I'm very clear what it was. I mortgaged the future of a project in the interest of a near-term operational and political gain.
Question 8. What would you tell your 10-year-old self?
Retire earlier.
Question 9. What profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
To be a professor of music.
Almost there, aren't you?
Yeah.
And question 10. If you had to spend £1 million in a day, what would you spend it on?
In one day?
In one day.
In one day, make a charitable donation to cancer research.
Great. Perfect. See, that was fantastic. Easy. Well done, Paul. Dale, over to you, mate.
Cheers, Val. So Al, you've had a bit of a warm up there.
Does he
Question
get the
one.
same? Does he get the same questions?
He does. He does.
Oh, it's perfect.
But he's got them right. So number one, what's your morning routine, Al?
It's usually a coffee and then a quick check of the diary, if it's a work day.
And how do you plan out your day?
I don't generally. I'm a very capable office manager. Karen does that for me brilliantly, so I don't have to worry about it.
Well done,
Good on you,
Karen.
Karen.
Yeah. Number three, how do you deal with stress?
It's either a walk or on the rare opportunity I can motivate myself to go out for a run.
Nice. Number four, your favorite book, audio, or movie?
That's a real challenge. I think it's a book I haven't read yet, which sounds bizarre, but I'm looking forward to A Promised Land by Obama, which has just come out and I know I'm getting for Christmas. So I'll be very surprised if that doesn't become a favourite.
There we go. Huge call. So maybe you should go into fortune telling. Number five, who is your hero and why? You can't say Val.
No, I'm not going to say Val. I'm going to refer to the aforementioned Mr. Obama. Actually, no, I'm going to change my mind. Sorry, I'm allowed to change my mind.
Of course.
My hero is a guy called Pete Souza, who was Obama's photographer.
Nice.
He did a brilliant job of that, but also became very political in the last few years, and I think has done a sterling job of presenting himself and that politics very well.
Nice. Number six, what is your favorite sound?
Waves crashing on a beach.
7, what is the biggest mistake you've made on a project?
See, I was thinking about that as soon as you asked Paul. Not trusting my first instincts about people on the project.
Wow, that's pretty good. Number 8, what would you tell your 10-year-old self?
Don't sweat it, it'll be all right.
9, what profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
Pretty obvious for me, photographer, landscape photographer.
Nice. And 10, if you had to spend £1 million a day, what would you spend it on?
Actually, this is going to sound make me sound really selfish now after what Paul said. Buying a house in the northwest of Scotland.
Nice. I appreciated all of your time, gentlemen. I love the banter. I love how much we go into banter mode versus serious topical mode, and there's so much knowledge, insight that comes out of this. And as I said, we'd love to have you back perhaps in season 3, because you've done both season 1 and 2 now. Perhaps another panel debate we'll have you on, or even a webinar. We've got some ideas in the pipeline. But thank you for your time. So folks, that's all we have time for on this episode, but it doesn't have to stop here. Support our charities and access blogs at projectchatterpodcast.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Can't even talk there. Don't forget to hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and your podcast player so you don't miss the next one. A big thanks to our guests, Paul Goodge and Al Simmonite. Also shout out to Dave Pulford for the amazing shirts, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Val, it's bye for now.